Hi everyone, my name's Richard Beckett. Thanks for taking the time to join us today for an interview with Sophos on how to navigate cloud security. Now, joining us today, all the way from California, we have Ganesh Krishnan. Now, Ganesh is our Public Cloud Security Group VP of Engineering. And joining us from here in the UK, we also have Guy Davies. Now, Guy is our Principal Cloud Architect, and he works as part of the Sophos Cloud Infrastructure Services team. How are you both doing today?
Doing good. Hi.
Doing great. Thanks.
Brilliant, brilliant. Okay. Now, as a global leader in next generation cybersecurity, Sophos protects more than 400,000 organizations today of all sizes in around 150 different countries, all from the most advanced threats. And today, what we'll do is discuss how to approach your secure transition to the cloud. We'll look at the cybersecurity fundamentals and how they really need to be reorientated to deal with cloud threats. And then lastly, we'll walk through kind of what Guy and Ganesh have learned really after years of working with security and DevOps teams around the world. Okay, now, without further ado, we have some questions for you both, and it'd be great to get your thoughts on them, as you both bring pretty unique perspectives to cloud security. So, Guy, maybe if I start off with you, can you maybe tell us about what brought you to Sophos in the first place and kind of what you do here, I suppose?
All right. So I've actually been at Sophos for a long time. I've been here working my way up through the ranks, I guess, for about 15 years. So I started off as a Unix sysadmin, and I've kind of grown. And then what really excited me, I think back in 2012 was when I first started playing with the cloud, was the flexibility of the cloud, and I've kind of pivoted my career into that. In terms of what I do, the Cloud Infrastructure Services team, we're responsible for our customer-facing production backend infrastructure. I do a little bit of DevOps, I build systems, I run systems, I work with my team to make sure that the systems stay up, architecting things, and specifically with a focus for the cloud, like helping my team to navigate that transition between classical on-premise infrastructure and cloud infrastructure.
Okay, fantastic. Sure, that keeps you busy. So, Ganesh, I mean, you joined Sophos in quite different circumstances than Guy, so maybe you can tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah. So I actually started my career about 20 plus years ago, have been in the security space, started as a software engineer, and then, grew into leading security teams, being sort of as a practitioner, as a security person at companies like Yahoo, LinkedIn, and Atlassian. And then while working at some of those companies, noticed that, cloud was taking off. It's still, growing leaps and bounds. But there weren't good security products that provided the visibility and the control and the security aspects that we needed for the infrastructure. And that's when sort of the idea of doing a startup came about. So I went from a security practitioner to a startup guy, and co-founded this company called Avid Secure 3 years or so ago, 3.5 years ago, and which was acquired by Sophos about 18 months ago. So lucky to be part of Sophos. So I basically at Sophos run the team that continues to build the cloud optics solution for Sophos. And that's why I'm here and glad to be here today.
Fantastic. Okay, now a lot of people are probably out there and they're maybe either planning a move to the cloud, or perhaps in the current circumstances, they're faced with now having to accelerate their plans into the cloud, or maybe just increase their footprint to maybe cater for additional remote working maybe. So Ganesh, how would you suggest people actually kind of approach that initial transition to the cloud?
Yeah. So, as some of you may already be aware, so as a security person, you always have this meme that says, hey, if you think you haven't been hacked, you just don't know it. There's an analogy for that in the cloud space, which is if you think you aren't yet in the cloud, You just don't know it. And so chances are you're already in transition. If you're a mid-sized, reasonably mid-sized company, somebody has created an AWS or Azure account and are deploying stuff and are playing around with it. So chances are you're already there. And under the current circumstances, you're probably looking to accelerate, you're looking to move more things into the cloud. Now, as you start to look at that, one of the things that comes up is obviously, the security differences between on-prem and the cloud, and specifically around who's responsible for security of the cloud, right? And if you look at cloud provider documentation, and there's this talk about shared responsibility where the underlying infrastructure as controlled by the cloud providers is their responsibility, and anything you deploy on top of it is yours. The way I would advise, or the way I like to look at it is, hold yourself responsible for the whole thing, and then figure out how you can leverage the cloud providers to make security easy for you. That's a much easier situation to be in. Think of security like you do today as it applies to the cloud. The basic concepts remain the same, but you can actually leverage cloud provider technology and tools out there to actually make security easier for you. So that's how I would look at transition.
Okay, fantastic. Now, Guy, I mean, I suppose it's fair to say that you're on the front line of Sophos's own strategy. So can you maybe share some your advice on how people maybe need to think differently, and maybe what you've learned how to work differently around cloud security?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, part of the transition to the cloud is actually leveraging the services that the cloud provider offers. So, as an example, if you were running, say, a database server, like locally at the moment on premise, actually, if you use your cloud provider's hosted managed database service, then they're taking care of a lot of that stuff for you. You don't need to worry about patching the machine. You don't need to worry about like keeping the SSL library up to date. All of these things. So above anything, the move to the cloud is you need to retrain your engineers, and you need to change your mindset, because actually the shared responsibility model does put some stuff on you as a customer of the cloud service provider, but also it allows you to make use of all the expertise and not have to worry about that stuff. You don't have to worry about like physical security of data centers anymore, things like that. Now, in terms of how we can actually really like accelerate our security posture in the cloud, cloud opens up things like infrastructure as code. If you have infrastructure as code and you're deploying all of your stuff via code, actually you're the humans, which is a big attack surface, the humans in your organization and humans outside of your organization don't necessarily have to have access to that control plane. Unlike on-premise, where somebody needs to get into that data center in order to set up a new switch or something like that. The cloud actually means that you can extract yourself away from that. And by using cloud native technologies, infrastructure as code, serverless, you can really reduce your attack surface, and at the same time accelerate your engineers, accelerate your developers, and get people doing more stuff quicker.
Okay, fantastic. That's great advice. Now, what about, I suppose, attacker behavior in the cloud? I mean, as a company, our latest market survey that we ran recently, that actually revealed that it was 71% of organizations who are actually hosting data and hosting workloads in the public cloud had suffered a security incident of some kind in the last 12 months, which is a huge proportion of the people that were there. Now, Ganesh, from your experience, because obviously you've worked from a number of large organizations as well, and small ones, which is a great range of experience, what type of threats were you securing against, or are securing against today in the cloud, and how might you suggest people stay safe?
Yeah, so the way I look at this is that the kinds of things that you need to protect against are very similar, right? So they don't change. So for instance, you need to have adequate appropriate visibility of what's actually running in the cloud. The same goes true for on-prem. You need to have basically protect your infrastructure, right? The same goes true for on-prem as well as the cloud infrastructure, right? You need to protect your applications. The same goes true for on-prem, and so does the cloud. And the same is true for data. You also need to protect your data, right? But what actually changes in the cloud is the mechanisms by which you do it, right? So like Guy was saying before, you can potentially leverage a hosted database with a cloud provider, so you have to worry much less about patching those systems or protecting, backing up the database and things like this. Those things get a lot easier. So you can actually leverage cloud infrastructure to improve security. Now, on the flip side, if you have a hosted database, you can, with a click of a button, make it available to the internet. Good examples come up as RDS or S3 bucket type issues, that have been fairly commonplace. So you do have to be careful and cautious about how you deploy and use and leverage the cloud infrastructure solutions out there. They will make your job easier, but you also need to make sure that you understand them well enough to protect them well.
Sure. Now, Guy, I mean, your team are going to spend a lot of time managing, I suppose, the cloud provider consoles themselves. So are there maybe services in there that you wouldn't be without? And how do you find that those native tools actually shape up to your needs, those that are included from the likes of AWS or Azure, for instance?
Sure. I mean, I think a key tool and a key part of your security arsenal is to have a really strong identity model. Connect up your cloud provider to your corporate directory. What this allows you to do is it not only makes it easier for people to access and to be able to innovate and pivot, but also it means that you have attribution. It's not a blame game. It's not this person's done something wrong, but it's a training game. Also with a service like CloudTrail, for AWS, where you're actually getting a log of what's happened. If you have it connected to your corporate identity provider, then actually you can see, you can act, you can leverage native tools to allow you to act on what people have done. And also, all of these cloud providers, they're API based. So they've got really, really great role-based access control. So by having a strong identity model with the people accessing your cloud provider, you can easily say, hey, this person's allowed to do X, this person's allowed to do Y, and this person may be allowed to do both. That's quite different to on-premise, where if somebody had access to your data center, they could probably do most stuff if they have a USB key or something like that. So it's very different. You can be more fine-grained. But in terms of like tools and indispensable stuff, learn the identity and access management, because actually that is key. Because even the cloud provider themselves, when they're doing things on your behalf, they're using your identity and access management, which you can control. So to learn that and to really understand that gives you a lot of leverage to both enable your developers and enable the people who are innovating on behalf of your organization, but also to limit the attack surface and limit the blast radius if something terrible was to happen.
Okay, fantastic. And I mean, how do you find those tools shape up? Are there particular gaps in there that you've found you've had to plug in terms of security?
I think in terms of identity and access management, the tools are great, but the visibility and things like that is maybe a little bit lacking. Being able to see, and as I said before, like if you're not like an IAM guru, then it's actually going to be pretty hard to work out who's allowed access for that. So that is where you may want to fill in with a third-party tool like Sophos Cloud Optics, for example, which will give you that visibility, particularly for those who don't live and breathe IAM all the time.
Sure. Okay. And Ganesh, when you've been managing teams before, how when teams are trying to knit all these various services together, because we've all looked in sort of cloud provider consoles, and they can be almost a bit of a scary place sometimes for some people. So what should people maybe look out for when they're trying to knit those services together? How should they approach that?
Yeah, I mean, like Guy was mentioning, right? Visibility is the key, right? You cannot secure what you cannot see. I think that's the first thing, is to make sure you understand what's actually going on, what types of clouds are being used. You may actually be using multiple clouds. So if you're so for example, a lot of companies not just using AWS, but perhaps Azure or Google or some combination of those, right? And so you want visibility across them, and then also products, that if you decide to use products that give you that broad visibility, like Guy was mentioning, like Sophos Cloud Optics, also look for products that provide APIs so that you can build around them. You can take the data from those products and join from other data, which gives you broader visibility. I think having the visibility in the cloud is what most teams I've seen struggle with, because a lot of times, stuff gets put up and, the security team has no idea. And I think that's the first problem to solve. And then, as Guy mentioned, locking down identity. And then once you do that, the rest will follow, right? Because then if you have APIs, you can join data together. If these tools, make sure any products that you use integrate with, your existing tools like SIMs and ticketing systems and things like this, right? And that will also help you get a better handle on this. And as you're starting out, which is really what we are talking about, that's the biggest problem you face. That's the biggest problem that I faced in my past life.
Okay, okay, thank you. Okay, so what about the dilemma that I'm sure a lot of businesses out there are going to face when they start that transition to the cloud, or maybe even when they're already there, and that dilemma of what or whether I lift and shift or refactor applications completely. I'll probably put this to you both, because you probably have two quite different perspectives potentially. How have you both tackled that whole lift and shift or refactoring choice in the past?
Yeah, so from my perspective, right, whenever you're looking at a big migration to the cloud, it tends to be closer to lift and shift, right? Because there's very little appetite to rewrite everything before you migrate something, and so that tends to be a logical move. And in that case, going back to the points that we've been making, is getting that visibility and locking down the infrastructure, because it's actually moving from a on-prem infrastructure where you probably had more controls and probably segmented, walled off from various places, to a cloud environment where a flick of a button can basically expose your entire infrastructure to the internet, is where you want to have visibility and you want to make sure that that infrastructure is protected. And then look at leveraging other cloud native technologies as well, to perhaps over time re-architect your application to leverage some of the security properties, right? Like changing databases and using serverless or container technology and so on and so forth, as you move through that journey. But the first thing for most people tends to be, if you're transitioning from on-prem, tends to be lift and shift for the most part.
And I think with a lot of places, they need to ask themselves what they're getting from the cloud. Because actually, if you're doing lift and shift, then you're not reaping all of the benefits of the cloud. Even things like scaling, auto scaling, things like that. If you are just lifting and shifting, it may be that your applications aren't architected for that. But so you're not reaping the cost benefits so much. And you're not also reaping some of the security benefits that you're going to get. Now, I mean, so Ganesh mentioned serverless technologies there. This is a big thing that doesn't really work on-prem. It's not really a thing. Now, we call it serverless, but there's actually a server in the background, but somebody else takes care of that. It's all about this abstraction out that somebody else is taking care of the nitty-gritty for you, so that you can get on with your job of innovating. So serverless, and using managed services as well. If you use managed Redis, or if you use a managed NoSQL database or something like that, that's actually, you're increasing your security posture. You are, and it's possible to integrate that into a kind of lift and shift environment as well. You don't have to go jump in with both feet. You can say, okay, I'm going to lift and shift my my compute, my application instances, but actually I am going to use a managed Postgres database or something like that, because that gives me some advantages. So if you're selling this to your C-level execs, you can say, hey, we can do this transition in a kind of managed way. And it means that what your engineers become, in general, they become infrastructure admins instead of system admins. And that can often be a challenge for your engineers. You have to work as maybe a cloud advocate in your organization. You may have to work on, selling the dream, selling the idea to your staff, because it's scary and it requires a mindset shift. Once that mindset shift has happened in your engineers, then stuff can start to accelerate. But actually getting your engineers on board, getting them trained up, certified if necessary, is a really, really great start, because it means that your engineers can see the benefit, even if due to time or resource constraints, a lift and shift is a necessary first step.
Okay. And did you, when you approached that yourself, did you carve out a particular portion of the team to focus on that, or was that you tried to educate everyone across the team at the same time?
I think it definitely helps to educate everybody across your team, because the end game of this, a cloud migration, and particularly if you're reaping the cost benefits and you're reaping the flexibility benefits, is that eventually everything's going to be in the cloud. And if there are some people who kind of focus on the old school stuff, and then there are some people that focus on the new school stuff, the folks who focus on the old school stuff may well end up disenfranchised. Yeah. So it's really, really important to get everybody on board with this. There's some reticence, and there is potentially some people who are skeptical of the cloud, and it's right to be skeptical of stuff. But there's a load of resources out there. The cloud providers publish resources specifically to help kind of allay those kind of fears. But it's right to be skeptical, and it's our job as thought leaders, I guess, to continue to preach the benefits, but also help our staff and our engineers to navigate that process.
Sure.
Okay. Yeah, and just to add to that the point of fear, right? If you ask 10 years ago, right, companies used to debate about the pros and cons of security, pros and cons of moving to the cloud versus staying on-prem. And because there was this fear of the unknown, because cloud was relatively new. And those fears are sort of, to the large extent, have gone, right? It's now more about how do we make it happen. And like Guy says, the time for fear is over, but and the way to look at this is, hey, how do I leverage the cloud native technologies to improve my security posture? And that's what I would think about.
And I think that you're completely right there. I think the way to sell it is the classic thing before, maybe 10 years ago, of why would I want to move to the cloud? I want control of my own things, so that I have the keys and I can lock it away and I know that it's good. The way to sell that is actually Amazon, Microsoft, Google, the cloud providers. They employ the best people in security in the world, because there are people clamoring to work for those guys. So we leave this stuff to the experts, because the experts actually know what they're doing, and not to say that the people in your organization don't know what they're doing, but these guys live and breathe just network security or whatever. And I think so we can leverage those economies of scale that the big cloud providers have.
Sure. Fantastic. Okay. So, I mean, is this transition ever complete? That's probably a self-fulfilling prophecy to ask that question, but is this ever complete? How are we doing?
It's getting there, but there is always going to be a lot of data gravity is a huge thing. So where you've got data and it's on premise at the moment, the systems that act on that data tend to cluster around that data. So it's like gravity, and actually moving that sometimes means you have to move both the data and all the systems that operate on them kind of in one fell swoop. Now, there are loads of tools out there that the cloud providers provide, but data gravity is a big thing for people kind of sticking on-prem for longer than they might have to. That said, it's possible. There are tools out there. And nowadays, I mean, particularly in the current times, you don't even have to have people's laptops and desktops and workstations. They don't need to be on-prem anymore. There are all sorts of great kind of zero trust network things out there. So it is eminently possible to have even a large organization, startups have been working from coffee shops for a long time, but like even a large organization, we're proving at the moment that even larger organizations can continue to innovate, continue to serve their customers, even though everybody's in the cloud.
And I suppose it's important to remember that even though you may be moving to remote desktops, they are still ultimately hosted on a virtual machine in a cloud that's still potentially susceptible to the same threats as a laptop, right? Is that fair to say?
Absolutely.
Yeah, and look, just to add, security is a process, not a product, right? And so the same applies here, right? Even if you start transitioning to the cloud, the security aspects have to be maintained no matter where they are. So it is sort of a never-ending thing, because the cloud technology themselves are changing the way they do things, and actually at a much faster rate than what we're all used to in the on-prem world. So I think from that perspective, it's an ongoing journey and transition. Right.
And were there any, from cloud migrations you've tackled in the past, were there particular challenges that kind of cause you to wake up in the middle of the night or not get any sleep at all? Were there bumps along the road that people should really be aware of?
Yeah, I mean, there's always fires and challenges and bumps. I think it really depends on sort of the nature of the transition. A lot of it tends to be in the initial stages is, hey, how do we get this big application running in the cloud when we were all used to the security controls that on-prem provided, right? So nobody had access to them. It was behind a wall, like as a firewall. But now the firewall is gone and it becomes identity. And it's not just the firewall, it's the identity and it's all these other things that are changing. So there's always challenges, and it's actually important to monitor this stuff on an ongoing basis. And I cannot stress the importance of that. So it's not that you move your applications and you're done, because at any given point in time, this stuff can get exposed to the internet. Like somebody accidentally can expose an S3 bucket to the world when that it's not supposed to be, right? That's one of the downsides of a cloud type environment. And so it's really important to actually watch this on a continuous basis. So it's not just during the transition. There is a lot of fires and sleepless nights, over my career on ongoing issues with the cloud infrastructure.
And I think it's really important for your security team as well to be on board from the word go. Because the cloud offers people so much freedom to innovate, it can, if you don't get those guardrails in, like right at the beginning, then it can turn into a little bit like the Wild West, right? And that could be really great because developers are free to do what they want to do, but you need to have those guardrails, those controls. So import things like your CloudTrail or your API logs. Import that into your security team SIEM. Get the security team trained up, as well as your engineers. Get the security team trained up on what identity and access management is all about, and actually get them cloud native upfront, as opposed to, it's really hard, particularly if a developer has been used to like playing in the Wild West. It's really hard to implement controls after the effect, because your developer is used to just being able to spin anything up and do whatever they want. So but if the controls are in there from the word go, then actually that's just the way it is. It's no longer the Wild West anymore. We've moved into the modern era. And I think that is absolutely key. Now, if you're just beginning your cloud transition, then that could be quite hard. You might say, what security guardrails do I need? But the great thing is that there's loads of white papers out there. There are tools to help you get this stuff set up automatically. Even if you don't think you'll need it yet, you will.
Okay. And I suppose that kind of neatly links to our next question. I mean, you mentioned earlier, part of this is actually fun, right? This is not all, this is what people want to be working on and we want to be moving to the cloud. I mean, you must have found both of you must have found some great tools, probably from quite different areas of the sort of security spectrum. Are there kind of, what are some of those sort of favorite tools that you might have found along the way that you might recommend to people?
So from my point of view, deploying infrastructures, looking after infrastructures, it might sound pretty dull, but infrastructure as code is key. Infrastructure as code leveraged within your SDLC pipeline as well. So you can go from having nothing to having a really complex, intense cloud native infrastructure with one pull request being merged into your into your source control system. Getting that stuff, that's really cool. And the great thing about infrastructure as code is if you want to make an update, you make an update, and it only updates what you need to do. That is that's super cool. It's kind of nerdy, but actually it enables so much other stuff that, you know, and it enables security, because if you've got infrastructure as code and your CI/CD system is deploying infrastructure for you, then you never need to give your developers access to a machine. Like, and that's probably a good thing, because, you know, people are often the weak link in IT security, for sure. You can have it locked down so it doesn't even have any SSH access from the internet. You know, like all of this stuff is possible. So infrastructure as code would be like the game changer as far as I'm concerned.
Okay. And is there somewhere you'd recommend people start? Is there something you'd point people to in terms of to learn more about that?
Choose your cloud provider and go read up on it. There's heaps and heaps of stuff. There's YouTube, there's there are white papers, there's good docs. All the major online learning platforms really do focus on the cloud. So yeah, go out there and find the information.
Okay, fantastic.
Yeah, and I would agree. Like infrastructure as code is, you know, pretty much one of my favorites as well. And it is also key to understand to actually, you know, automate as much of that as possible, and integrate security early in the cycle.
Yeah.
Right, and to the extent you can integrate a lot of the security testing and checks in the CI/CD pipeline, in these tools, in infrastructure as code, that's a lot. You'll be able to detect issues earlier that way.
Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah. Your security team may well be very used to doing code reviews on your application, you know, secure coding practices, things like that. If they're used to doing code reviews on an application, then passing them a bit of YAML, which is your infrastructure as code definition, they can do a code review on that, and they can pick out the security holes, or you can use an automated tool like Sophos Cloud Optics to pick out the security holes in your source, in the source of your infrastructure before it even gets deployed to dev. You know, so it's it's really key, and it's not a huge pivot for your security team as well.
Okay, fantastic. Now, I mean, we've spoken a lot about advice. I mean, this whole session's been really about your advice to people moving to the cloud. But perhaps are there maybe the top sort of 3 things that that you would, I don't know, maybe not top 3 things, but are there certain things that you might do differently if you could do it all over again?
Do you want to start, Ganesh?
Yeah, sure.
Go for
it. So 3 things I would do differently is, you know, a lot of times when you're starting this transition, chances are you already have a security program that's tailored towards what you currently have. And what people find is, as they move to the cloud, making cloud security a first-class citizen, not an afterthought, becomes a challenge, right? Because you have certain ways of doing things, and cloud can radically change that way of doing things. But to the extent you can make sure to make cloud security a first-class citizen, not an afterthought, is the number one thing that, you know, I definitely would do differently, you know, considering what happened in the past in my case, in my experiences. Mm-hmm. The other thing is, keep this in mind, you are responsible for your own cloud security as well, like you are for your on-prem. People may tell you about shared responsibility and you know, outsourced stuff, but that's not the case. Make sure you own the whole thing, and then, like we have been saying, leverage the cloud provider security aspects to make security easier for you. So that's number 2. Number 3 is ensure you have good visibility around the cloud environment and infrastructure, and integrate that process not just in your live environment, but also as early as possible in your development environment. So those were the 3 things that I would suggest.
Okay, my three things are a little bit more kind of specific to implementation, maybe. So in terms of things that we would have done differently, I've been working with the cloud since, I think 2012 was when we cut our first AWS account. And back then, a lot of the tools that, that people use commonplace now just didn't exist. And a lot of the concepts hadn't really been thought of yet. For example, and a great example is a multi-account strategy, or in Azure, they're called subscriptions or GCP projects. Initially, the idea is, okay, so I'm going to open an account with like AWS at mycompany.com as like the email address, and that's going to be our AWS account. No, that's old school thinking. Actually, create an account. The second kind of iteration of that thought is, okay, maybe I'll have an account for each different department or each different product. We'll have an account for product X and an account for product Y. Yeah, that doesn't really cut it. What you actually want is a separate account or separate subscription or project for each individual application, and potentially more than one account per application. That's got multiple benefits. First benefit, cost attribution. You know, the finance guys are going to love that because they can directly attribute cost. But from a security standpoint, it's great because even if you've messed up and you've exposed via like an overreaching IAM policy, you've exposed something in your account, you're limiting the blast radius to that account. Yeah, okay, it sucks because somebody might be able to compromise something, but they're compromising one application or even one environment of an application. They're compromising your QA for application X as opposed to compromising everything. So multi-account strategy would be my my top tip. The second thing is to, as I said before, have a strong identity model, especially if you've got a multi-account strategy. Like you might have hundreds of AWS accounts or hundreds of Azure subscriptions or projects. Now, somebody's got to manage that, and the only way to do that is by having a strong identity model. Use SSO, use Azure AD, use SAML Federation, something in order that people can have access to what they need access to, but not too much access. And the third tip that I would say is, particularly if you're coming to the cloud fresh, and particularly if you're doing like a stage migration, not a big bang migration, the default thing is, oh, I need network access back to my on-prem data center, right? So I need my stuff in the cloud to be able to talk back to my on-prem data center. So I've got to set up a VPN and I've got to do all of this stuff. Like, think to yourself whether you really, really need that. Like an example is, okay, I need to get files from an on-prem filer. Well, actually, if you have something that's syncing stuff up to object storage, to S3 or something like that, you can leverage those cost benefits without having to have that tie back to your on-premise. That tie back to your on-premise, if you sever that tie back to on-premise, you're protecting both the cloud and on-premise, because lateral movement is a standard technique from the attackers, getting into one and then managing to get to the other. So use the features and functionality that the cloud gives you to decouple that, which means having like building stuff afresh in the cloud, having your data synchronized up to object store, because once it's in the cloud, you can get access to it from on-prem. It means using message queuing systems, using technologies like SQS, things like that, in order to decouple as much as you can your on-prem stuff from the cloud stuff. That usually works. Sometimes you will need network access back to on-prem, but if you only need it for a few things, then that's good because you're reducing your attack surface.
Okay, fantastic, great answers. And I suppose as we wrap up, are there places that you tend to go for your information? Is there podcasts, blogs, white papers, that sort of stuff? Are there places that you would go at the moment for information, or you'd suggest to someone who wanted to learn more?
So for me, you may have been able to tell I'm mostly an AWS guy, and like the AWS blogs are great. The amount of developer resources that all the cloud providers give are great. There are meetups. There are, I mean, at the moment they're online meetups, but you know there are physical meetups when we get through this. Also, and there's loads of information out there, customer forums, also things like Reddit forums and stuff like that. And also from a security point of view, you know, follow the security blogs, even if it's not specific to the cloud, to have an idea of where the security landscape is lying. So follow something like our own Naked Security blog, or other blogs like that. Follow podcasts and just get yourself informed, because the cloud isn't that different to on-prem. You know, there are differences, but if you're interested and engaged and a technologist, then the similarities outweigh the differences.
Okay, fantastic. Well, Guy and Ganesh, thank you so much. Thanks for sharing all your advice today. It's been a fantastic chatting to you all again. Now, for more tips around how to really properly secure your cloud infrastructure and your environments, I'd love to invite you to head over to sophos.com/7. And there you'll find a downloadable white paper with some additional 7 best practices on securing the public cloud. So with that, I'd just like to say thank you very much for joining today. Thanks again to Ganesh and Guy, and have a great rest of your day. Goodbye.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.